Welcome to the Rural Blueprint, a podcast celebrating the innovative spirit of rural entrepreneurs who are transforming their communities. I'm Brad from Reinventing Rural, and each episode we spotlight small business owners and community partners who have built thriving enterprises in rural America. Join us as we explore their journeys and strategies, providing inspiration and practical insights for anyone passionate about rural development and entrepreneurship. I'm excited to welcome James Allen Parker, who is the CEO of the Northwest Native Chamber, to our Reinventing Rural video podcast. Welcome, James.
Well, thank you, Brad, for having me and having the Chamber be a part. Brad, we've been connected despite not closely working together for many years. So consider us a fan of the work that you're doing out there and excited to have a conversation with you.
We're certainly excited to have you here, an opportunity to talk about what you're doing. And although we focus on rural, I want to hear a little bit about, the urban initiatives, the rural initiatives, what you're doing, and how you've grown your organization, particularly on how the outreach works and how you're able to support, underserved communities and underserved individuals to help them with, growing economic wealth and starting new businesses. How about you give us just a few minutes of your background? Because you've got a pretty interesting pathway.
Sure. It's always a good idea to start with introductions, and it's always good to know who you're in the room with, virtually or otherwise. My name is James Allen Parker, enrolled citizen for the Chippewa Cree Tribal Nation out of Montana. As you said, Chief Executive Officer for the Northwest Native Chamber, serving Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Primary residence is in Gresham, Oregon, about 20 minutes outside of Portland. Been out in Portland for about 15 years. Blessed to have a beautiful wife and 3 healthy children. I previously served in D.C. in executive management for one of the oldest Native serving nonprofits, the National American Indian Housing Council. Was there for 10 years. Moved out to the Northwest, founded J. Allen Enterprises, do business consulting, primarily focused on Native nonprofits, tribal businesses, and tribal enterprises. With that time, I spent a lot of time with the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, which is a regional policy and advocacy organization representing nearly 50 tribes out here in the Northwest. Initially as a consultant, later on as deputy director, and then acting director. Spent about 10 years kind of supporting that organization. I kind of in the last 3 years of that, worked both as the then executive director for what was then Oregon Native American Chamber and at ATNI. So especially during COVID. So that was a couple of big hats to wear during, frankly, a public health crisis and a financial crisis rolled into one. And with our communities at the forefront and on the front lines of impacts from that. So over the past few years, dedicated my time primarily to what's now known as the Northwest Native Chamber, our expansion both geographically and in services we provide. And I would really give the credit for how we serve community, really centered on our ability to take a step back, see what was working, what was not, and see what we could do to be part of building really more of a landscape that supports entrepreneurship at a higher level and much deeper. And that really brought us back to the idea of pillars of service and how we engage, right? And so we developed, all our programming fits within these 3. Education and growth. That includes our Student Achievement Award program that primarily benefits rural students. Native Enterprise programming that supports reservation-based businesses. We're really proud of Native Enterprise program. It was one of the first things we did here, which was create an accessible education tool that is not just rolled out by us, but made available to any organization or business that's serving our underserved communities. And the idea behind that was it was video-based to make it accessible, even the most rural and remote parts of the state. But it was also an opportunity to really showcase Native entrepreneurs that are from the Northwest. In a lot of ways, our students are able to see friends, relatives, people they know and look up to as part of that curriculum, really kind of helping the confidence of that. Also within the education and growth is our startup platform, with Brad, you're probably pretty familiar with. But the idea behind that is how do we collate and create a collection of resources that are both timely and helpful for entrepreneurs. And the idea of making it accessible and internet based was we didn't want this knowledge to just live in urban hubs or kind of more traditional settings for business engagement, but really the opportunity to make it accessible to everyone, kind of flattening out that geographic divide with that approach. And then our technical assistance program, which reaches both statewide and frankly in a tri-state area. Really proud of that program and how it's grown. At this point, it's the largest technical assistance program serving Native and tribal small businesses in the country. And it focuses on both one-on-one and peer-to-peer technical assistance, but it also looks at workforce development, contractor development, government contracting, clean energy, cannabis. We're looking at supporting native agricultural businesses, wood product businesses. How do we create hubs for these businesses? Look at export opportunities, both intertribal, traded sector, and international. And so we're really excited about the continued direction of that program. Our other pillar of service is building relationships. And that's kind of always centered around bringing people together with really knowledgeable speakers, with an opportunity to network, getting to know business to business, getting to know decision makers in procurement circles, and then really bringing forward Native-owned businesses as a whole to larger market. And then economic justice and transformation is our third one. And that really focuses on advocacy and representation strategies and ensuring our community's voice is heard at decision-making spaces and places where traditionally we have been either excluded or marginalized. And we'll talk a little bit about this, but we know policy and budget decisions have far-reaching effects on our communities, and that we need locally driven solutions that work best for our communities. So that's long-winded. I was going to say a little bit, but long-winded intro.
You guys do so many great things, and I think that's what's really important here. And you approach a ecosystem like yours, it needs everything. It isn't like we focus on here because we just focus in here. This isn't going to get taken care of, and we're not doing this. And so you have such this broad mission because all of the parts are interconnected. If you don't have economic justice, you don't necessarily have representation or the funding going in or something to do the important things, even to help someone who's just starting a coffee shop. And if you're not focused, you have both an urban and a rural constituency, and you can't just focus on traded sector because that's not going to help very many people in rural. You can't just focus on local sector because you've got opportunities to grow bigger businesses. And I think also there's not, I know it's for me, a lot of understanding about individual businesses owned by tribal members versus tribal businesses and tribal enterprises where a tribe is trying to develop larger businesses to bring more economic wealth. There's those pillars you're working amongst as well. And each one requires a different approach.
Absolutely.
You know,
To me, it lines up kind of with our mission statement, and you can find that kind of thing on our website. But it's really how do we shift the economic landscape for Native and tribal businesses across the Northwest? One of the core tenets of that has always been working with the whole community to develop solutions. And I think that's what we talk about when we talk about landscape and we talk about ecosystems. It's really understanding how they fit within. And so what you just said makes a lot of sense. Part of, I think, why it was such a good match between me and the Native Chamber is kind of born out of my experiences as a business owner, as a consultant, and kind of looking at times well-resourced network of service providers. But too often it was siloed. Too often it focused on outcomes and metrics of a specific agency or program or curriculum. And really what we really need to do is focus on the individual business owner and what their aspirations are for the business and making sure they're well equipped to achieve what they want to achieve with their business.
and I agree. And that's really our approach in rural. We battle that traded sector, non-traded sector, battle a lot. And, you're a small town, rural community, 500 people. Guess what? You know what? A coffee shop is a very important business to have running in that town. And it's not going to become traded sector probably. But without a coffee shop, you lose your living room. You lose your place for a community to come together, and you lose the place for people to feel connected to something. And so we on that rural side are always saying it's one person at a time, one business idea at a time. It's someone launching a small 1 acre organic farm. It's someone doing something as wild as composting, like Liz is doing up in Wallowa, that area, Enterprise, and all of those areas. And it's really interesting. Or it's areas like Lincoln County where there's not enough people that are getting access to mental health services, and it's helping one person spin up one more small counseling office. And it's lots of little tiny pieces that all come together to make a big impact, I think. You wear a lot of hats too. I know that not only are you the CEO of the Northwest Native Chamber, but and you're also J. Allen Enterprises, but you serve on some governors, Racial Justice Council. You co-chair the Community Economic Council. Tell us a little. You and I connected with the Oregon Small Business United during COVID. That was really the first time we got to really connect and get to know each other. And then also you introduced a couple things with the city of Portland. Maybe tell us a little bit about how you managed to wear all those hats.
I think we all wear a lot of hats, and we can probably go down the line at anybody within our organization or the businesses we work with, and multiple hat wearing is part of the job description. I think it's great to have the opportunity to be in a state that wants to engage with your expertise, with your connection to communities. And so we have the opportunity to serve on, for example, you mentioned Oregon's Racial Justice Council, serving the governor. Been really appreciative of the opportunity to co-chair the Economic Opportunity subcommittee of that. And what it's given us is really being able to hear from all corners of the state what the priorities are, being able to match them with policy priorities, with budget priorities, and then being able to see that being stood up as a priority of the governor, seeing it reflected in the governor's recommended budget. Those are the kind of things that we would like and should expect from our government. Absolutely. As you said, Oregon Small Business United, another kind of the other hand of that is the fortunate to co-chair the Community Economic Coalition, which is made up of the culturally specific chambers serving across Oregon, but really looking to grow that. And the idea behind that is how do we speak with a collective voice? We often in this country hear a lot about divides, but there's a lot more that unites us than divides us. And when we have the opportunity to really come together and build coalition and speak to our priorities collectively, we have the opportunity to be more effective, to see more wins, more accomplishments, and really lift up community that leads to healthier outcomes, more opportunities for prosperity. And so that's kind of ideas behind connections with these task force. City of Portland, it's been great to work on their budget advisory committee or their economic recovery task force, work closely with elected leaders. Because I think that's one of the best things that elected leaders can do is listen. We say leaders, but really what they are is representatives of their constituents. And they need to hear from us about what those solutions are. What are the problems that we're facing? And here are some solutions. And we'd really love for you to go to bat for us. And let's try to make these things happen. How do we create the ecosystem that we want our businesses to thrive in? It really takes partnership all along the way. So that's what it's meant to us.
I love that. I love your approach. You've got to be heard in the halls of Salem or Washington, D.C., and because they're not hearing about the problems that are existing in Umatilla or somewhere. They're different challenges,
Yeah.
particularly when we start to talk about our rural entrepreneurs who lack. We were just talking before we started recording about broadband access, and we lack. We're losing banks, rural banks. We lack financial access. We lack expertise. People that can just help you figure out how to start your business or grow your business or scale your business. And then you're 50 miles from anywhere. What are we, 95,000 square miles just in the state of Oregon, and you're covering 3 states? All right, it's only 300 miles the other. It's a huge area. Just in Oregon, we're not even talking about adding into that Washington and Idaho, which you cover. I want to flip a little bit and talk specifically about Native entrepreneurs in rural and I want to get your opinion, your thoughts, and really the challenges that you see them facing and how your organization and other partners, because we all work with several partners. We have some great partners out there we all collaborate with, are trying to really bring services down to that. Because you're underserved if you're in rural, and then if you are of a certain demographic or you're tribal, or you're doubly underserved in rural. I mean, you're even further challenged to start, launch a business. And we all know that the ways to get out of persistent poverty, develop economic wealth, is home ownership, and it's running a small business. There's starting your own business and your own enterprise is an opportunity to help build something and to lift you up.
I couldn't agree with you more. When we look at, so I'll say one of the things we say wealth, and wealth can mean a lot of different things, right? And I think one of the language we like to use is really that opportunity for prosperity, because wealth sometimes can have a negative connotation in terms of we looking at it as hoarding resources. But the idea of prosperity is something different. And what that really means is healthy families that are able to achieve levels of education, families that eat well, have some autonomy and decision making about their lives. And that's what we think about. When I hear wealth, I think prosperity, and that's what comes to mind for me.
Great way to look. I mean, it's a much better frame.
Well, and it matches what we know when we talk about rural native entrepreneurs. What they do is carry a tradition of trade and commerce that really dates back to pre-colonial times, right? We're talking about the Columbia River, we're talking about the Willamette Valley, we're talking about coastal. There's always centers for trade and commerce that brought together native and tribal people from throughout the Northwest to be able to exchange goods. But it was beyond that. It really was not just an economic hub, but it was a social hub. It was really a time to bring new families together, old friends together, to marry, laugh, live, and love. And often, as humans do, it is through economic activity that it kind of encourages that. And so understanding the context that we looked at as rural native entrepreneurs facing just a number of entry point issues and capital access and this, know that there's always been a long tradition of trade and commerce amongst native and tribal people, specifically here in the Northwest. And so kind of what our job is how do we continue to support and develop that cultural continuity, that economic innovation. And when we're successful at that, what we see is communities becoming more resilient, communities with the opportunity to grow. And we're not talking about just individual business. As you mentioned, maybe you look at it as just a coffee shop. Well, that coffee shop is absolutely a meeting point, a place to reset yourself. These are all really critical things that really combine to build a stronger fabric for a community. And whether you're talking about 500 people, 3,000 people, or 100,000, ideas, you need these things connected to you. So when we talk about rural entrepreneurs, we talk about, well, how do we restore and bring forward kind of the 21st century of that prosperity that so many of our communities enjoyed back then?
Yeah, we share a vision of community-led entrepreneurship. The further it gets pushed down into local communities, and you listen to those local communities, and you find where their gaps and resources are, and find ways for them to help backfill those gaps. I think the more successful it becomes. You leverage the local skills and local talents and local knowledge, and obviously this ability to work with artisans, makers, creators, and growers, and leads itself to, that's where trade originated, is in all of those kinds of products. And I don't know how we got away from so much of that, but from our perspective at Foundry Collective, it is critical that the small towns are the ones that are leading their knowledge. They may not have the expertise, or they may not have the tools, or they may not have necessarily all of the pieces and parts, but they know what they want to do, and they know where they want to go with it, and they know what's best for their communities. And I think that's vitally important. And so these top down, I just got asked a couple of days ago about, do you have any great examples of rural accelerators? Well, come on, really. Accelerators need density. First and foremost, you need density to make an accelerator work. You don't have density in our rural communities. So no, I don't. What I can tell you is we have models of helping individual communities grow their economic opportunities through entrepreneurship and whatever that may be. And we always talk about Innovation is simply finding a new way to solve a problem, and entrepreneurship is finding a way to make money doing it.
I think you brought that up a little bit earlier, and we look at entrepreneurship as that opportunity for prosperity, because you look at really three ways to make to build wealth, as we'll call it in this country. It's land ownership, it's investment, and it's entrepreneurship, right? And what's most accessible to our communities that don't have an overabundance of accumulated wealth or intergenerational wealth, it's through entrepreneurship and small business ownership that makes a difference.
So, how do you give us some numbers? Tell me a little bit about your impact because you've done amazing things, and I think everybody really would love to hear about how much you do with so little.
I think that's a great question. And I think about we've had the opportunity to grow. I think we had a good strategy both for our organization, but really centered around how do we best serve and and so I think the larger community has responded to that. And I think we have high expectations of delivery of service and delivery of programs. And as you know, it really takes a team to get anything accomplished. And so we've been really fortunate to have absolutely amazing staff, including Amber Faze, that's really driving our programs. And so we can speak to the success of that. We look at serving 900 plus businesses since 2021. And I would say the clear majority are in rural and on reservation communities. We're talking about our clients representing over 112 different tribes. And with the majority of those, once again, located in small towns and rural areas. And I think one of the things that we've been able to accomplish with our partnerships is providing that at little to no cost to ensure we're reaching entrepreneurs to where they are. We know it's been policy and budget allocations in decision-making circles that have benefited more traditional businesses. And frankly, we think putting the onus on the community most hurt, most impacted by those decisions is frankly not the right direction. And so we expect similar investments that we've seen elsewhere into our communities to provide those services. As you mentioned, how do we get away from supporting small businesses? Well, supporting is the key word, right? Oregon runs on small business, and it does today. So then how do we pivot back to making sure that we're investing and using public dollars and using our elected leaders to ensure that we're reinvesting in the backbone of Oregon economy, which is small business.
It's a challenge because you're telling a story of a single small business doesn't success doesn't necessarily make the front page of the Oregonian. Whereas some of these larger solutions that keep being thrown at some of our, particularly in our rural communities, they do make front page news. They don't necessarily, at the end of the day, I think impact as many families as everyone would like them to believe. Also thinking when we talk about innovation, I'd love your thoughts about this. I know that in a lot of rural communities, there has been a lot of talk about they're not innovative. A lot of rural communities just don't feel like they can change things or they're able to change things or that they are can be creative in their solutions. And one of the things that we've done for the past few years is really gone out and talked about innovation in rural communities and using latent innovation metrics and such to really talk about those as opposed to the way that everybody thinks, oh, you're launching a spaceship that can come back to Earth and land on it. It's the same place it took off from. Innovation is figuring out how do you add 5 additional childcare. They had to care for 5 more children in a town of 300 people. How do you solve these what are not necessarily considered big problems in a lot of places, but in little towns has a big impact. If you have 2 people spin up some in-home childcare, and suddenly you've got 10 more kids being taken care of, you've got 10 more people that can be out there working or be out there starting businesses or doing whatever they might be. And so a lot of really saying changing the tone of innovation doesn't happen in rural, but in the reality is almost all innovation happened in rural or happened in rural. It all was driven off of agricultural or timber or mining. It was all linear innovation. And now we only look for these moonshot innovation. That's all we celebrate.
I couldn't agree more. When you look at constrained markets, when you look at rural and small town, you really have to be innovative and you really have to understand how is product, my service going to impact people in ways that they need, frankly, right? That's what an entrepreneur, we always say, I like how you talk about accelerators and such. Entrepreneurship is a lot simpler than that, right? It's people solving problems, and that's what it is.
And hopefully making money. Hopefully at least breaking even. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I think when you're innovative, you should be successful, and I think you should have that opportunity for that. But at the root of it is oh, this shoe doesn't fit me well, and it doesn't do what I needed to do when I'm hiking or I'm running. You come up with a new shoe, right? And that's as basic as it gets about understanding entrepreneurship and innovation is that they're intrinsically linked and you really can't separate them, no matter where your approach is. And I think when you look at that approach in a rural setting, it requires even more innovation in the sense that you don't have access to all the same resources to really develop that next business in rural just absolutely requires a next level of innovation.
You don't necessarily have access to, it's not like you can run down to Costco. You're starting a food truck in the middle of nowhere. You may have to go 2 hours each way just once a week to get your supplies, just to pick up your hamburger. It really is the challenges of starting successful rural businesses, just from logistics and just from and demand and having access to market. We're fortunate that technology has become affordable in a way so people can be selling online. They can. There's a lot of things that have leveled the playing field. I think there's no better time. There's never been a better time to start a small business in a rural community now. I think there's more support and there's more focus on it than ever. It's not nearly enough. It's still insufficient. And it's still, the delivery methods are still somewhat inefficient in ways. There's two things that you've said that are really important. One is uplifting native businesses. Tell me a little bit, maybe a story or two about some native businesses and tell me, I'm a firm believer. I always say you can't be what you can't see. And if we aren't uplifting successful rural businesses and native businesses and Latino businesses, if we're not showing that these things are out there and are successful and can be growing and telling those stories, nobody else is, it's going to be harder for someone else to take that first step, that first leap of faith. So tell me about how you uplift and how you bring attention to the native businesses that you guys are working with.
Oh, and I think that's central. And it only happens with trusted relationships and knowing intent. And when you walk into a community, to know that you're here to listen and that you're here to support local endeavors and that you're here to bring resources, not necessarily all the solutions. And I think we also have to acknowledge some of the unique challenges that Native and tribal businesses face on and near reservation. It always starts with capital, right? When you're looking at how traditionally businesses start and are able to grow, a lot of the seed money comes from intergenerational wealth and capital access that shows up through home ownership and embedded community lending. And that's been largely absent in Indian country due to policy and decades of underinvestment, many different reasons, but it still is the reality of how do you start a business with next to no capital. And that's one of the not completely unique, but certainly weighs heavy in Native and tribal communities. And so that really starts with a couple of things is acknowledging this and then seeking out and developing relationships with community lenders that have that experience and have that understanding and know how to navigate Indian country. And another side of that is how do we call for state and local policy that reflects these issues? One of the things that we worked on back together, Brad, was the loan loss reserve funds, right, to offset lending to constrained markets. How do we use policy and action of government support and alleviate what we know are major constraints and, frankly, roadblocks to entrepreneurship, both in tribal and rural communities? So that's one aspect. The other aspect is making sure that it continues to be locally driven. Part of what we do is we meet people where they are, both figuratively and literally. Do a lot of virtual advising, in-person visits, having staff located on and near reservation and rural communities, really strong and trusted partnerships, both tribal nations and rural native CDFIs, to really, rather than expect that entrepreneur, that small business, that community, to find ways to bring people to, whether it's urban hubs or traditional business support infrastructure, but rather bring that infrastructure out there. Like we said, broadband technology, and then advocacy and direct programming, and really tying all those things together to make a landscape and ecosystem that's much friendlier. And then one of the things that we really love is that our technical assistance program, typically at no cost, typically very hands-on. It's got more handoffs. These are really long-term relationships that we build with the entrepreneur that can walk them through all the different scales from ideation and startup to growth patterns to when it's time to exit the business, really kind of being that partner throughout that process. And one of the things that we're being able to be successful with this TA program, it's really designed around building and strengthening the landscape of community need and really taking a more holistic approach. And it's why we focus more on resource navigation, is because we really took time to develop a network of professional service providers, typically native, rural, BIPOC owned businesses that are vetted, that then serve our clients. And in that example, what we're looking at is a client in need of accounting and bookkeeping services that may be working in Pendleton or Umatilla area will receive services from a native-owned bookkeeper in Southern Oregon, for example. This results in both the client receiving the needed services to grow their business, but also supporting the market for the bookkeeping services and really creating connective tissue between them. And there's multiple examples of that, right? When we're talking about food producers and fishers with market stores that specialize in farm to table and local products, right? These are the kind of things that we're talking about. So it shows up for us. A native-owned media firm based in a rural community, connecting them with a indigenous construction company that builds sustainable housing to tell those stories, right? So it's really these underserved, too often marginalized communities, their businesses being able to serve their own businesses and ensuring that there's a hands-on approach to walking through that as the business owner moves through. So that's just like the idea of how you build a healthy ecosystem for small business. That's
Yeah.
one of the ways that we're doing it.
And it's so critical because in larger communities, you still have sector specific. I mean, you go back and you look at Silicon Valley, and those companies have prospered because of the fact that there's so much sector rich information and skill sets and everything in that area. And we're never going to have that, particularly in our rural communities, because you may only have one person in your town that makes sausage. The next place that makes sausage might be in Southern Oregon. But if we can connect those two businesses so they can share knowledge with each other, that's one of the most powerful things that we can do. And if you're right, if you can connect someone that understands a tribal business from the bookkeeping and accounting side with them, and they may be in two entirely different sectors, spaces within the state, those kinds of connectivity are critical because we don't have that closeness and that cluster type of ability where someone has worked for three software companies, he's just going to the fourth, he's taking all that knowledge with him or her to along with that. And I love that. You have something coming up called the Gathering 2025. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of our signature event. It's an opportunity to bring 400 plus of our closest friends together to really celebrate and excellence in experiencing indigenous and native entrepreneurship. And an opportunity to really not only experience but celebrate. We're talking about often for the past few years, we've really focused on food, fashion, and music, kind of artistic expressions of that entrepreneurship experience. And it's really a time to raise visibility for Native businesses across the state. Many of our performers, our chefs, hail from rural regions. And it's really kind of an introduction to that larger urban market, but also just an opportunity to just raise up and acknowledge and hold up as an example where we'd like to be, where we continue to see ourselves going, and to really build solidarity in our approach to it. So it's October 9th. It is in Portland, Oregon. We talk about density. It's a good place to host an event. And I'd love to have you all join us. What I really want to leave us with is, and I mentioned it earlier, is like idea between bridging divides. I feel like in a lot of ways, those divides, of course, very real when we're talking about geographic. In other ways, our communities a lot of the same challenges, and our voices are so much stronger together. And need to be active in advocacy. Need to bring resources to our communities That's best done together. The things that didn't get to talk about in my time in DC, what shaped my career is understanding policy development. And while term solutions are best developed locally, the idea is to bring alignment of resources at all levels of government to support what we know community needs. And it takes us working together. And that can affect real change. I saw my father, reason I had time in DC is my father worked for Senate Select Committee on Indian Affairs during the pivotal time, and saw his hard work kind of go into federal Indian policy development that changed the landscape for Indian country forever. Talking about welfare or Indian gaming, a lot of that was priorities at a local level, galvanized policy and resources into our community that then supports infrastructure, housing, healthcare, all the things that we need to really kind of thrive. And we should be looking collectively together. What are the 21st century for our communities collectively?
Thanks for listening to The Rural Blueprint. If today's conversation resonated with you, visit us at reinventingrural.com to access resources for rural entrepreneurs, funding opportunities, and business development programs. I'm Brad with Reinventing Rural, and we'll see you on the next episode of The Rural Blueprint.